Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at Lund University. Remember, you can connect with the show on Twitter by following us at SMNP Podcast, or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, I'm going to be speaking with Craig Stadler. He is the founder and CEO of Petey, which is a video search engine that actually gives you results outside of YouTube. Because if you think about it, anytime you're searching for a video or searching for something and a video is suggested to you, most often it's coming from YouTube. And we've seen other alternative services pop up, for example, Brave as an alternative to Google Chrome, or DuckDuckGo as an alternative to Google Search. But to date, there hasn't really been an alternative to YouTube. And I think that's the space that Petey is trying to fill. So it's not a platform in the sense that you sign up as a user and, interact with other users on the platform. It's more of a search engine that draws video content from 63 different sources to date. That includes platforms like Instagram, Twitter, but also some kind of ones that we don't think of so often, like Vimeo or BitChute. Craig and his team at Petey have been building crawlers and aggregating these videos into a search engine that focuses on users' privacy by not tracking their search history or their IP addresses. So this episode isn't focused on politics as much, but I think it's interesting to talk to a software architect who's been working with video and streaming and search architecture since before YouTube became the huge platform that it is today. And I think it's particularly interesting to think of this conversation in light of our last episode where we talked about content moderation, to look at some of the steps that Craig and his team are taking in a way that promotes a kind of transparent and privacy-oriented platform. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Craig Stadler. Again, he is the founder and CEO of Petey. Craig, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
So can you start out by giving us a brief introduction into the type of work you've been doing around search architecture over the years, and maybe how that experience played into your decision to start Petey?
Sure. So I have been involved in developing and refining search engines for e-commerce and all kinds of different things for the better part of a decade now. I've created a couple of different vertical search engines, and by vertical, I mean things that maybe Google doesn't do specifically or doesn't do so well. So yeah, I've been involved in those for about 10 years or so, and then maybe a year and a half ago, I was doing some research for search engines that cater to closed captioning in videos, being able to search for closed captions within videos and identify videos that have captions for the community that would require those, or researchers, or these kinds of things. And in doing that research, I kind of figured out that the video provider landscape had kind of collapsed and kind of dominated primarily by YouTube, but there were still a lot of players still in the game, so to speak. And by that, I mean like Dailymotion and Vimeo and Veo and Metacafe and these type of things that were much older video search engines, but didn't have much visibility at that point in time. And so I started to do more research, and I found out that there were some YouTube competitors that had come out in the lieu of censorship issues and demonetization and deplatforming and new rules that YouTube had set out, that some tech companies had set out to create new video platforms. And so with that in mind, I realized that Google Video Search and all the video search engines that were out there, be it through Bing or Yahoo or that kind of thing, were largely catering toward, for whatever reason, YouTube videos. So I decided to do something to the contrary of that, which is provide visibility for all the players rather than YouTube. Doesn't mean YouTube isn't included. It's just that there's a higher focus of content from all those other players. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to kind of break down Petey in a second. But
sure.
First, you started a video streaming service back in 2001 called CTube. Can you describe what that was?
Yeah, so long story short, when I was about 27 or 28 years old, back around 1997 or 98, I moved from Atlanta, Georgia, which is where I attended college, to the Bay Area, essentially during the dot-com boom when all this stuff was kind of just starting. Obviously, I think Google started in 97 or 98, so it was around that time. And go forward a little bit to like 99 or so, I realized that there were some streaming providers out there that had content for like Real Player, Windows Media, QuickTime, things like that. And there were live streams back then, believe it or not, as well, to watch live television. But there was really no software out there that catered to, being able to find live streams essentially and watch live television. I mean, we totally take it for granted at this point, but back then, around 1999 or so, there just wasn't anything. And so I decided to come up with a piece of Windows desktop software and, at that point in time, Macintosh desktop software that would allow users to watch streaming online live television broadcasts. And so in searching for a name, it was still difficult back then because a lot of people were snatching up domain names.
Right.
I had the affiliation from my grandparents that they would always talk about watching the tube and that kind of thing, short for television tube, I guess. And so I looked, and sure enough, there was really nothing on the internet that mentioned the word tube other than some medical things from what I remember. And so I decided to call it computer tube, which is C-tube. And so came out with that. I want to say we had a few hundred TV stations and had partnered up with real networks, and where we were on the homepage of Netscape and things like that, and did really well with that, with the software company that I had that sold that. And then I basically pivoted onto some other technologies and kind of phased that out. But it was interesting that a few years later, coincidentally, YouTube came out in the early 2000s, early-ish 2000s, I guess. It's still speculated whether they were influenced by the name of my software or not, who knows, kind of thing. But it's flattering if they did. But yeah, so that was my software company I created in the late 90s, and then moved on to doing other things, and then migrated into creating search engines.
Interesting. So yeah, we were talking a lot about YouTube in our last episode, and I'm a bit too young to have seen the rise of YouTube. I kind of just took it for granted. How did it kind of, going back to those times where you had C-tube and then YouTube was coming up, how did it actually get to the place that it's at now as a sort of monopoly on videos?
It's really kind of difficult to say because I think it happened for me in the blink of an eye, so to speak, because I remember when YouTube came out, obviously there were a lot of other video providers as well, upload services, I guess, if you will, same kind of thing. But I think strategically, Google paid a really sizable amount of money because of the growth that they saw in YouTube. I can't remember the name of the company or who actually owned it before Google did, but they obviously saw a lot of promise in the hyper growth that was being experienced by the company that owned it before then, and decided to obviously purchase them and grow that. And I think part of it, from my own speculation, has a lot to do with partnerships with other media companies and advertisers and all that kind of stuff. But I'm sure, given the amount of investment they put into that, it was very strategic to grow it to the sizable giant that it is at this point. So.
Yeah, kind of capture the market early, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I also think, too, as well, that I think that may, and I'm speculating, but it may have been one of the reasons that the content restrictions were a little bit more lenient in upwards of maybe even 5 years ago kind of thing. Because I think if you're wanting to achieve like a mass market and a mass number of users and following and that kind of thing, you may not want to start out with the most stringent rule sets that limit, I don't want to say like any specific form of content, but some forms. And then obviously make decisions after that, after the company grows to a certain point. And I think that's what's happened. Interesting.
Well, let's pivot over to PeteyVid, which is kind of what we're here to talk about. Can you describe PeteyVid for us, kind of how it works and the type of content it offers, maybe how that differs from what's on YouTube?
Sure. So when I started doing my research, I noticed that, like I said, a lot of these older players were still around, and obviously it was just a natural, instinct to include them. And by saying including them, I'm the primary software architect that wrote the aggregators or crawlers, if you will, to gather this information to put it into the search engine. So PeteyVid, in a sense, is a video search engine that searches 63 platforms other than YouTube. And that number sounds very, very high in comparison to what most people would think is out there. But we actually did end up finding 63 so far to date video providers, be it, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Vimeo, Veo, all these kinds of things. So the idea essentially was to create these, aggregators, crawlers that would pull this information in and then allow us to design the relevance for the end user kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And then allow the user to search, and then they get back the videos that they want, and then they can go visit the site that hosts them. We don't host any videos, so yeah.
Right, exactly. So you kind of go in, you type a search query, and then it shows you different videos that are on Instagram, Twitter, BitChute, kind of some ones I haven't heard of. Yeah. And then when you click on it, you actually go to that platform or that website that's hosting the video.
Yes.
And I think one of the key things is that you don't actually track users' IP addresses or their searches, right?
No, we don't. So basically, when I was, designing the proof of concept, kind of the beta, if you will, so to speak, the initial thing that I had in mind was giving people the exposure to all these platforms and videos that they might not see otherwise, giving them a lot of diversity and variety kind of thing. And that includes even in different languages as well. So having done the initial stages of that, I saw that there were a considerable amount of privacy issues that people were concerned about, be it, having their data sold or tracking or cookies or these types of things. And I know that there are certain, companies that rely on that as part of their revenue model, but we decided not to do that. And there's a multitude of reasons. One of them is that we do believe in individuals' personal right to privacy to just go in and use a service and not necessarily agree to their IP being shared or their, information about what they're doing shared. Not necessarily that it's bad, but it's just a matter of them having control over that. And then secondarily, we wanted to try to embrace newer revenue models that have to do with user support subscription, like through Patreon and through merchandise and things like that, rather than relying on reselling their data through data brokers and things like that, which tends to be a very controversial subject for a lot of people. We decided to mix some of the old and some of the new into our revenue model. So, yeah.
Right. And also, I saw that you have, they're not really ads, like ads to click through Amazon or eBay and get that sort of windfall by clicking through the site, right?
Yeah, and that would be me referring to some of the old, which means they're affiliate links, essentially. So if you're searching for something on something political, so to speak, maybe it's President Trump or something, we basically use that search query itself, just the keyword itself, not anything about you or where you're located. But we pass that over to Amazon through their catalog, so to speak, and then we offer you whatever it is that they think you might be most likely to be interested in possibly purchasing. So it's just a link. It's not even a banner advertisement or, a JavaScript pop-up or anything like that. It's a very, very simple link to try to keep it very, uninvasive and simple for the user to decide if they're interested in engaging or not.
Gotcha. And so because PDVid doesn't have users per se, right? You don't subscribe to the platform. It's hard to get a count of like, what's your monthly active users or something like that. But do you have an idea of, how many people are visiting the site, what the traffic looks like, maybe where they're coming from?
Regionally, I think our top two visitors are from India and the United States, from what we've been able to tell. And on the high end of things, keep in mind, we've only been out a year and some change, a year and a couple of months, but we're receiving about 15,000 unique users a day, which is more than we had expected. We were planning on somewhere around like the 1,000 range or a couple thousand range. So that's doing really, really well. And like I said, we didn't really target users from India, but we welcome users from anywhere, so to speak. So, yeah.
Right. I ran an ad for the podcast in Google search and everything came from India. It was kind of driving up my cost per click and all that. So
right.
I don't know what's going on there. But anyways, looking at kind of the differences between PDVid and YouTube, I mean, we've kind of talked about them where you're not actually hosting any of the videos. You're just kind of aggregating and then linking out to the platforms where those videos are. So my question is, would you consider PDVid a platform or an archive or a database? Do you draw a difference between those different terms?
I kind of do. And what I tend to defer to is, I would say, traditional search engine. And by traditional search engine, if you think about it, you probably heard about like, well, back in the day, there were, search engines where basically you go and you type in a search term and you find what you want and you just read it or go to wherever you want to go, kind of thing. A very, very simple 1-2-step operation. Well, that kind of migrated into the user's ability to create an account, to get suggestions of content that was more like something that the system already knows that they're interested in. A lot of that kind of stuff, targeted advertising, geospatial related stuff, so that if it knows that you're looking for lawnmowers, it will suggest one from your local, whatever, vendor, that kind of thing. And so that's more like later stages of search engine architecture, I believe, with the offerings. And we're sticking toward the really early stuff, which is basically you go in, you type in your search term. If someone across the world types in that exact search term, it's going to give them exactly the same results. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter what you've searched for previously. We don't have any accounts, that kind of thing. So it's a very, very bare bones, simple, like to the point endeavor. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a follow-up question on that, which is, last episode we were talking about content moderation and how platforms take different approaches to ranking and filtering content. And how do these processes work on PDVid? I mean, how does the search architecture decide which videos to present on the front page, for example? And are there ways that users can kind of flag content for removal? Like, how does that ranking process work within the search engine?
So there's a couple of things. I'm going to start with your last question and take that first.
Yeah,
which
sorry,
means,
I just asked a lot.
No, it's fine. So when you were talking about removal, we do support what's called a DMCA takedown, which is Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It basically means if a user has something that they own or that they're a part of an organization that they own that they don't wish to appear somewhere, whether it's a document or a video or whatever, they can issue that to a website or to a content provider and say, hey, I need you to take this down, that kind of thing. So we have a way for users to do that. Ideally, what they would be doing essentially, though, is since we don't host content, they would be going directly to the content provider. So, for example, if YouTube had a video that they wanted removed because there was something, whatever reason it is, I can't tend to speculate, but they would go to YouTube and they would file this, and then YouTube would take it down. So what would happen is if they did that, ideally they go to this where the source is, essentially, because we're only cataloging the sources. When we go to check these things, we'll notice that it's not there anymore, and we take it out of our index. So it kind of works with the source, so to speak. So you don't necessarily have to take them out of both. You can just go to the source, take that out, and then we remove it, obviously, from ours. We can take it directly out of ours, but that doesn't mean it removed it from the source. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So that's how the removals tend to take place. We've been around a year and 2-3 months. We've never had any requests for takedowns or anything like that. Now, you might say, well, what about questionable content, these types of things? Now that subject essentially gets into all these platforms that we've included in all their videos, which right now I believe is about 470 million videos that we're indexing or cataloging, so to speak, across the 63 systems. We handpick all of those systems. And the reason that we do that is because we want to make sure that there's no questionable content. And by questionable, I mean illegal, child pornography itself, those kinds of things, because we want to maintain a very, I don't want to say family friendly, but safe search kind of environment as closely as we can. We're basically putting the onus, so to speak, on the content providers. So when we include Twitter videos, we assume that Twitter does their job in making sure that there's no severe content on their platform, which they do a very good job of that. It's in their best interest to do that, as anyone is. The only caveat to that would be that in other cultures, like say in Russia or Japan, that kind of thing, their level of acceptable sexual content and that kind of thing is different than the United States. So in particular, we found a social network platform called VK that's in Russia. They are very, very loose when it comes to erotic and sexual content. And so for that matter, we had to kind of build a filter so that when we would get that content, we didn't necessarily 100% believe that it was clean, but we did the best job that we could making sure that the pornographic content didn't get pulled into PeteyVid.
Right. I'm thinking about this difference between platform and search engine. And it's interesting that your service or the search engine is kind of different because it is kind of shifting the accountability to the rules of the platforms themselves.
Right.
And I guess in one way that's smart because it kind of gets around a lot of those issues. You're not particularly liable. And so I'm thinking if we take Google as an example of a search architecture, isn't it still, there's certain decisions that search engine makes in order to rank content. And so right. I'm curious how that works on PeteyVid, because those decisions are ultimately made by developers, right?
Well, or the algorithms that they develop, essentially. And
yeah,
I think
exactly.
That would be the differentiation is, with Google Video Search, which I would tend to have that be referred to as a counterpart or competitor to PeteyVid because they both search for videos and they're not hosting sites. So essentially, Google has their model of what they feel relevance is. And that's gauged by a lot of different factors. I think last time I read, there were like 200 different factors, at least, for just the Google web search. So I'm sure many of those apply to the Google video search. And many of those probably apply to YouTube specifically as well. And a lot of that's probably proprietary, and a lot is based on user activity and clicks and when it was uploaded. It's very complicated, obviously. I can't really speak to the specifics because I'm not really, schooled on that. But what I will say is with the PeteyVid model, since we are kind of divorcing ourselves from the tracking like user activity and what users are clicking on and how long they're spending on it and all these kinds of things, it tends to be, like I said, that really old school simple model that has to do with where does the keyword appear, what's the keyword density like. There's a couple of different factors, basically. How many documents does it appear in? It basically more so has to do with the traditional, what's called full text index, which is basically, it's kind of like if you open a book and you go to the back of a book, the appendix is there. And so if you want to find out what pages, the word entry is on, that kind of thing. You go to the ease and you find out what page is on. It's a very simple concept, very similar. So as far as engaging any kind of algorithm beyond a simple like keyword match and couple of smaller factors otherwise, we don't really engage in any of that as far as that goes. I think on Google's approach, there's some really, really great points to that, but there's obviously some points that people have some issues with as well in perceived bias and perceived censorship and that kind of thing. And I think that's where a lot of the heat's coming down at this point.
Yeah, definitely. And so I'm curious, how do you think that impacts the user experience? Because, on YouTube, for example, even though there's been a lot of controversy around, going down rabbit holes of right-wing extremism content, stuff like that, there is an argument to be made, I think, that those algorithms sometimes help you discover content that you might not have seen otherwise, but that you actually enjoy, just didn't know about. So how do you see it with your model on Petey Vid? How does that impact the user experience compared to YouTube when discovering content?
Well, I can't really speak to how their algorithm determines that, unless it's, like I said, in speculating based on other users' activity, with similar interests and things like that. And that's all well and good. I'm sure for some people that functions incredibly well. In our case, if you're looking for, I'll just basically make up a term. There's an old comedian, his name's Stan Freberg, that influenced Weird Al, for example. Okay, so I'm a big fan of Stan Freberg. He was, around in the, I want to say 40s and 50s, something like that. Did a lot of comedy spoofs and skits and these kinds of things. And so let's just say, for sake of example, I'm looking up something on Weird Al. So I go into Petey Vid and I type in Weird Al, and then things come up that basically mention Stan Freberg, saying that, Weird Al was a huge fan of Stan Freberg and, influenced by him. I would see that in the search results and it would be, maybe hashtagged or something. And then that would maybe inspire me as a user to go in and be like, who's this Stan Freberg guy? And then I go in and type in his name. And then I found out a whole bunch of comedy things in relation to that. So but the system does put a little bit more of the, I don't want to say responsibility or work on the user, but it kind of does to a certain extent. It's up to the user's interest in doing further research, but the information is certainly presented there. And I think having the amount of volume that we do, we're approaching 500 million videos at this point that we're going to reach in the next month. We're at like 470 million right now across, like I said, 63 platforms in every language. It really gives the users the ability to find and discover things that they may not have known about or didn't really know existed before. And I think that's really a huge part of our goal.
Yeah, because I think I'm thinking the difference between like Google, Bing, and DuckDuckGo, right? Like you'll get different results for each one that you type keywords into. So
sure.
Maybe we're sometimes overly reliant on the Google algorithms and the so-called Google Archie. But I want to ask how Petey Vid kind of comes out as a service alongside a lot of other different alternatives to the mainstream kind of dominant players in the market, right? We have Brave as a competitor to Google Chrome, DuckDuckGo to Google. You've got platforms like Minds, Gab, all these different startups that are basically saying,
sure,
hey, we're different. For different reasons, right? And so I'm wondering how you see Petey Vid fitting into that ecosystem of alternative services, and why do you think it's been so difficult for challengers to kind of break through?
Well, I mean, this is an excellent question, and I went through the same thought process when I started the entire project. And essentially, when I started the project, I started to ask as many people as I could if they use Google Video Search, and across the board, 100%, not one person out of probably 100 people in 2 months, because I counted. I asked to use Google Video Search, and they all said, no, I just go to YouTube because Google Video Search only gives me YouTube anyways. And so I started asking, do you use Bing Video Search? Do you use DuckDuckGo Video Search? Everyone said, no, I go to YouTube because all I get is YouTube. And that got me thinking, wait a minute, there's got to be more out there than just YouTube, kind of thing. And so I started doing more research about new social networks, and I found out about Minds and Gab and Kadias and MeWe and Mumblet and a whole slew of these things that have been birthed over the last, 3 to 5 years, less than that maybe. And so I'm thinking, this is great. All these people are making these alternatives to Facebook, to, Russia has their own alternative to Facebook, and, all these things. But what I noticed there was really no alternative to Google Video Search. And when I say that, that applies to other things as well. Like when you go to Yahoo, video search, you're going to get YouTube stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If you go, it's like no matter where I went, there was like all YouTube. Which I'm not saying anything bad about YouTube in particular. I'm just saying there's a whole piece of the internet there, or pieces, that could be completely, overseen in the user's experience. And so my goal essentially was to create something that could live alongside of those other competitors and be a competitor to Google Video Search, not a competitor to YouTube, because we're not hosting videos, but it's more so to do a more extensive or expansive job than Google Video Search does. And since Google Video Search is being used so heavily within like Bing Video and all these other things, that's how we can kind of stand out, by really shining a light on all these other video providers outside of just that one. So that's kind of my hope, is that we can live in that ecosystem with a lot of those newer offerings and kind of stand on our own, so to speak.
We were talking about comedy a bit earlier, and you were talking about Bing, which reminds me of a bad joke. So maybe I'll test it out on you.
Okay.
Do you know what Bing stands for?
No.
But it's not Google.
Oh,
I don't know where I heard that. Some long it came to mind. Whatever.
Yeah.
So my last question, it's a bit of a hardball question, which is PeteyVid really focuses on privacy by not tracking the IP addresses of users, for example. But one thing that I noticed when I was typing in different keywords on the platform is that there's a lot of content from like Instagram that comes up, or Twitter, and I was wondering, to what extent is that an infringement on privacy of those Instagram creators, because they didn't consent necessarily to being on PeteyVid? So how do you see that aspect? I mean, of course, the videos might be public, but is there any, potential infringement there with your aggregator service?
That's an interesting question. Basically, I guess what I would say is our kind of line in the sand, so to speak, has to do with, we have gone on to Google Video and things like that and deeply searched for Instagram content being indexed or Twitter being indexed, and we have been able to find it. It's just it's not readily available. So if you type in, like on Google Video, plus site : twitter.com / Trump, you can get videos from Twitter about Trump, or that somebody's, whatever kind of thing. So part of our thing is, if we can find that it's been indexed by other web pages, other services, other blogs, these kinds of things as readily available links, that seems safe to us. And the reason is because we're not using any mechanism that logs in with an account to get hidden content or private content, that kind of thing. So, and you saying it publicly available content, that's pretty much where we draw the line in providing that. And like I said, if a user wants to have that removed from our index or that kind of thing, we provide the ability to do that through our terms page. So
yeah, interesting. Well, yeah, it's a cool idea. It seems to be picking up some traction. So I'm very curious to see how it unfolds over the next couple months and years. And Craig, thanks for taking the time out and telling us about PeteyVid.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
I've just been speaking with Craig Stadler, founder and CEO of PeteyVid. If you're curious to check it out, you can visit peteyvid.com. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll be speaking with Lord David Putnam and Dr. Kate Dommett about their work on the Democracy and Digital Technologies Committee for the British Parliament. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmo. See you next time.